Oh, hi, Lawrence.
Nice
Beth.
to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too.
I'm just gonna get it. I'm gonna put myself off video for 1 second. I'm a little chilly.
Sure. Hi, Jenny. Great to see you. Let me just say congratulations, at least electronically. So.
Should I be muted?
If once we get rolling, I'll ask everybody who's not part of the roundtable to mute. But for right now, we can talk.
Okay.
Let everybody get added here.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Jenny.
Hi. It's
I
nice
am
to
Beth
see you.
Daly.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. Hi. Thanks for letting me join on last minute.
I'm delighted you could join us.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Hello, Jean. It's nice to meet you after emailing so many times.
I've had this experience so many times where I email extensively with someone and then they turn out to be not the gender I thought.
Oh.
I mean, I've had that happen like 20 times.
Yeah. It's true.
Hey, Deborah. I feel like we've met. I've read so many of your books, but I don't know. You're muted.
So we ended up with about 25 people expressing interest. I guess we'll see how many actually join us today. You know, I'm delighted we got a decent turnout considering there's so many other events going on today. And of course, it's also a work day for most folks.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. People are juggling a lot of stuff.
Yeah. In fact, look, I think I just got one more request for the Zoom link. Yeah, here, hold on just a second.
Okay. Okay, Susan, I just got your text.
Great.
Hi, Susan.
Hi there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jenny. I'm so delighted to see you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for squeezing me in.
Always. You've been on my screen all week, so I feel like you're practically in my house.
I'm glad to hear that.
So has the little thing come up saying this is being recorded and we have?
Yeah, it said that when I started it, and I double checked the
great.
recording settings before I started the session.
Okay.
It should all be working, you know. As I said in a couple of emails, I'm somewhat limited in my functionality because it's an institutional Zoom account, so it's not, some of the settings or presets I can't control. But hopefully it will record accordingly and save to the cloud, and then from there we can do whatever we'd like with the recording.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. I don't know about anybody else, but I do have a cat that occasionally decides to wander in. Usually at this time of day, she's sleeping in a comfy chair in our master bedroom, and I'm just going to hope she stays there. So
I have a mom who occasionally wanders in.
okay.
I have children, so we can all have it. Let me pause my Slacks.
All right. Now let's see. We have 4 minutes to go.
So I closed my door in the hopes that my dogs won't bark and my mother won't come in while we're doing this panel, but I have no guarantees.
What is it with moms? I mean, my mom is like a renowned neuroscientist, and I can't get her to understand that I'm like on a Zoom meeting. Just always comes in, here's your mail. I have a question I really need to ask you, you know.
Well, I already suggested that we should do an Environmental History Week Pets of ASEH Zoom session where we just allow.
Oh, I love that idea.
But
yeah,
they didn't go for it.
Idea.
I can't believe that, because those are the most popular OUP events. They're global and usually organized by OUP Canada, and people from like 3 continents bring their pets and like stay online for an hour to introduce them and talk about them.
That's great.
I'm actually writing this idea down as someone who's actively marketing a book. That's actually a great idea.
Yeah.
So you should look also for the strand that Tom Nichols did. I mean, he's like an Uber like Twitter person, and he did Pets of Expertise. His book was called The Death of Expertise, and he had people tweet him their pets showing expertise. And I certainly didn't follow them all, but it was one of his more popular threads.
Oh, that's great.
That's a
That's
great
fantastic.
idea. Yeah, that's a great idea.
We had an office lunchtime kind of get together recently, and there was some business to do over like lunch at your computer if you wanted to eat it in front of everybody. But then the conclusion was people demonstrated what they've been doing as their hobbies in the pandemic. So one person showed off her oil paintings. Another person showed off all her knitting, and her knitting is spectacular. And then another individual who's very athletic has been doing aerial acrobatics using silks. And so she showed video clips of some of the things that she is achieving. You know, these acrobatic silks, and they hang in a very tall room, and people climb up and wind themselves in, and then they tumble. And it requires incredible strength and coordination. And this one editorial assistant in our department ran 2 videos demoing what she has achieved with these acrobatic silks.
Wow.
Amazing.
Okay, well, we'll give it 1 minute and then we'll get started. Okay.
All right. And if anyone else emails for the Zoom link, I'll obviously give it to them. Just as a reminder, and then I'll turn everything over to Jean. If you're not an active participant, please remember to keep your audio muted, just so we don't have any more external noise than we have to.
Okay,
but thankfully,
great.
this isn't a ginormous crowd, so it shouldn't be a major problem. But otherwise, Jean, I'll turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence. Hi, everyone. Happy Earth Day week. Thank you for joining us for this ASEH Roundtable, promoting your book in a pandemic, a roundtable with writers and publishers. I'm Jean Thompson Black, and I'm Senior Executive Editor for Life, Physical, and Environmental Sciences, Medicine, History of Science and Medicine, and Environmental History at Yale University Press. I'm the moderator of today's panel. My co-organizer, Susan Ferber. Susan, why don't you wave? There you go. Is executive editor for American and World History at Oxford University Press. She will monitor the questions in the Q&A section. You can start putting questions into the Q&A anytime, and we'll turn to them in the second half of the panel. We put this panel together because as editors, we are part of an industry that is in transition. That was true before March 2020 and will no doubt be true when we are meeting again in person at a future ASEH. Change may be the only norm anymore. Our jobs include helping our authors understand the world into which their books will publish and to translate what is going on in the broader publishing and media landscape. We would like to give our authors and their books their best chance at success. Today, our panelists and we are offering some perspectives on promoting a book in a pandemic, whether it's your first book or your 5th. Some changes were already on the horizon before the pandemic struck, and they have accelerated, necessitating new approaches. One change that will be known to many of you already was the loss of more traditional venues for print reviews of books, and greater reliance on social media and author-created content. Another is the sudden change in university library buying patterns, with campuses closed, many institutions cutting back on buying titles as print editions and taking ebooks only. Budgets have been slashed, perhaps more so for books than journals, and the result is more purchasing and licensing of digital content and not print books. But there's actually good news amidst all these changes. At this time last year, everyone in the book publishing industry feared the worst about lockdown. Unable to go out to movies, theater, and sports, people would only turn to reliance on streaming content, Netflix, Hulu, Twitter, you name it. We had every reason to be fearful. Brick and mortar stores were closed and Amazon literally stopped ordering books for about 3 months. We found that people also turned to books, and the publishing industry had its most successful year in a decade. Granted, many of these books were cookbooks about baking sourdough bread, educational books for homeschooling kids, and books about race in the United States, and not necessarily books about environmental history. But the trends are interesting. 2 articles from this week, one in New York Times and another in Publishing Perspectives, nicely encapsulate what's happened. We will put links to both articles in the chat section. Here are my 7 top observations. No surprise, because bookstores were closed and people were home, more sales occurred through Amazon and big retailers like Walmart and Target. Many university presses now see half, or in some cases, far more than half of our sales coming through Amazon. Amazon was already our number one account, and the past year has strengthened this position. There was an increase in sales of backlist books or books published by established authors. Sales of audiobooks arose. Sales of ebooks really rose. Whether people are experiencing screen fatigue or will go back to print books in classrooms for academic/professional purposes and for pleasure reading remains to be seen. But so far, indications are that print sales are up nearly 30% for the first quarter of 2021. Bookstore closures had a negative effect on discoverability of new authors and books. Keywords as applied toward finding books using search engines have become even more critical. In lockdown, authors and readers have found communities, many of them on Zoom, drawing audiences that never would have gathered in person in such numbers. What is clear is that many issues related to the environment, climate change, fossil fuels, sustainability, human-animal relations, sales of protected wildlife refuge land, environmental racism, the Green New Deal, spending time in the outdoors, disease vectors, and many other topics that members of ASEH have devoted their careers to focusing on are getting more and more attention in society than ever before, not just in the United States, but around the world. Your expertise and ideas matter, and as editors and publishers, part of our job is to help you envision them as books and to disseminate and sell them in whatever form people are reading. To help work through these issues today, we have the benefit of learning from a group of talented people who come to books from different perspectives. So as I call you out, maybe you just want to raise your hand and wave. They are Brenda King, Publicity Director at Yale University Press, David Miller, President of Island Press, Deborah Kramer, author of wonderful books about the marine and shore environments, including most recently, The Narrow Edge, A Tiny Bird, An Ancient Crab, and An Epic Journey. There's a copy over my shoulder there. In addition, we have Beth Daly, editor and general manager of the Conversation media outlet, and Jenny Price, author of the newly published Stop Saving the Planet, an Environmental Manifesto. So now we're going to get to the roundtable discussion with our panelists, to be followed by your questions. So here's the first question. What is going on with book review editors, producers, and bloggers during the pandemic? Brenda, would you like to kick this off?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you, because that's the question, right? What is up with them? Well, they're not in their offices at the same time that we all went into lockdown. They did too. And thereby disrupting the entire chain of how we get our books reviewed, how we get our authors interviewed. Suddenly there was no place to send. all those review copies. And we had to reinvent how we get news of our books to those editors, those journalists, those producers. So as Jean mentioned, a lot of these changes were already underway. For art books in particular, Yale has a very large list in art history and publishing art catalogs for major art museums around the world. We had already, the trend was to use locked watermarked PDFs of those highly illustrated books to reach out to media. The lead times just seem to work in terms of the way those books are produced. So we just pivoted, and rather than printing galleys, we just used locked watermarked PDFs, emailing, setting up some Zoom calls with some of the editors for the main publications, the very top ones, New York Times Book Review, New York Review of Books. How do you want it? Basically we just had to figure out, how are you wanting your materials? And we just provide it that way. Dave Miller, in terms of same thing, I'm sure all publishers were scrambling to provide. And Kirkus would say, well, fill out this spreadsheet here. And Library Journal would say, well, send these PDFs over here. It was very different outlet by outlet, how they wanted to have materials delivered to them. And we just, needed to do that. It became a very a la carte kind of process. The upside to that is we were able to cement relationships with a lot of our top media contacts, and are getting to know a lot of other people, and giving them what they need, be it images through Dropbox, access to our authors, the whole smorgasbord. While they too were trying to figure out how to homeschool their kids, or deal with a sick relative, everything else that everyone else here was dealing with at the same time.
Thank you, Brenda. Beth, would you like to take a stab at commenting?
Yeah, so my perspective is from a very different perspective. I was a longtime environment reporter at the Boston Globe, and so I'm coming from a journalistic standpoint, also involved with ASEH, Society for Environmental Journalists, for a long time, and remain so. So I actually don't know what's going on with the bloggers. What I could speak to is perhaps, I don't want to get too far ahead in the conversation, but what I've noticed from my friends who've written books, and also at the conversation where a lot of people write for us, and then they write about a piece of their book, usually have to be an academic, and then that often gets picked up. But some ways I've noticed that has really worked, like if you can get a review in Society of Environmental Journalists journal, you're reaching a lot of the environmental journalists that may in turn decide to reach out and interview you. I think there's been some success. There's like $100 you can pay for like a little ad at SEJ that often I know has been very effective for some people. And also there's the conversation, and we're not out to make money. We're a nonprofit independent news outlet, but we often write 800-word stories that are written by experts about a subject, not a whole book, but a piece of a subject in a book. You have to be affiliated with an academic institution usually, but sometimes there's exceptions to that. And when a story is published in the conversation, it's great. It's published on our website, but the real power goes through all our stories go out on the AP Wire, they go to Yahoo News, and most authors who write get in about 14 to 15 news outlets, and they tend to be contacted, and their book sales, we've documented it, tend to go up. So that may be an option for some people. I don't know, but I'll stop there, because as far as the blogging and review books, I don't know that much, but those are my helpful tips for this.
Thanks. David, would you like to comment from your perspective?
Yeah, to sort of take off from Elizabeth, we rely a lot on environmental organizations for our marketing, and particularly the communications that they have, whether it is something like Sierra, the magazine of the Sierra Club, or newsletters for members and things like that. And we find that's actually a really good way to reach what are often very relevant audiences to a particular kind of book. So whether it is the Sierra Club, or for our built environment books, the American Planning Association has a number of communication things. And we found that in the last year or so, as they too were all at home and dealing with the kids and all, if you had very targeted sorts of things for books that really fit their thing, they actually really appreciated if you could present to them a really straightforward, here, you can use this and make good use of it. And that's been it's an important part of what we do anyway. We have a very active partnership with the environmental community. We actually have a partnership manager who manages these things. But we treat that media as important as the New York Times Book Review and all the others.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's hear from our authors on the panel. Deborah, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I guess I just want to start by showing this slide that I have, if I can make sure I can do it. Because for me, I guess just responding to what David and Beth have said, I have always relied on the environmental community. They've been tremendous supporters of all of my books all the way through. But I just wanted to show you this slide. If I can get it up here. Because to me, this is the situation with everything that I write about. The things that I write about don't read and they don't buy books. So, and they don't vote. And the last part of it is actually really important to me in terms of what it is that I'm trying to do. So COVID is just another challenge that's in the way, but for me, letting people know about my book and letting people know about the policy implications, that has always been the same, COVID or not COVID. This is just another interesting challenge to this. And I guess in terms of the COVID, I'd like to say that Zoom was a challenge for me at the beginning. And I don't know how many of these, Jenny, you've done already. I found that Zoom was actually fabulous. There were, I had a talk that was supposed to be at the Boston Athenaeum. It ended up going online. There were people there from all over the world. The attendance was much, much bigger than it would have been if it had been at the Athenaeum itself. And for all of the implications that came out of the talk and all the people that I met, it was an absolutely fabulous thing. I think the challenge for everybody is that when you run talks through Zoom, it's extremely difficult to sell books. I have basically a 30 or 35% sales rate at every personal engagement that I have. And on Zoom, I have no idea what's going on, and the bookstores don't always show up to do what they're supposed to do. So they have to be monitored very carefully. And then a lot of it's all going to Amazon and people buying used books. So I think although my coverage has greatly increased, my sales have probably gone down. So that's all I want to say right now.
Thanks, Deborah. Jenny, what's your perspective?
Of course. Yeah, so I'm very early on in this process. My book came out like 2 days ago, I think, or no, four, whatever, a few days ago. So I'm still trying to figure out the sort of post-launch process. But one thing I would say is that I think that, what everyone will tell you is that the author is more and more and more involved. I think publishers used to, decades ago, take care of pretty much all the marketing. And now I think it's very, very much a partnership, and that everyone says that the author really, and my own editor has told me this multiple times, like my most successful authors are the ones who really do a lot of marketing themselves. And so I would say I think anybody who's published a book understands that actually getting onto blogs and reviews that process starts months and months and months before, right? So I think there's all kinds of ways that I've found that authors can really work with the marketing team at the publishing house to help them, because they, you're the one who really knows, like, what are the audiences, you really think this book is going to reach. What are the, you might know about all kinds of podcasts and radio shows and festivals and all kinds of things where you have either already been on them or you think they're really good. So your publisher might have a more standard list of places to target, and you might be able to really help fill in with a lot of more specialized ideas, I think. One thing I would say that I am starting to figure out in terms of blogging and is that the author has the license to be a lot weirder than the publisher does, right? So, for example, my book came out on 4/20, which is Weed Day. And my book is really aimed at a younger audience. At least I'm hoping I'll reach a lot of younger people. And I kept telling my publisher, Norton, like, hey, it comes out on Weed Day, also Hitler's birthday, but maybe we could ignore that one. It comes out on Weed Day, maybe we could do something with this. And then my millennial nephews were really pushing me, like, do something with this, get Snoop Dogg to read your book, and I was, well, I don't know if I can do that. So I suggested that, and they just didn't see that at all. So, which I understand why they wouldn't see it, but it was something that I ended up doing, sort of an informal, let's get high launch, that I think ended up attracting more interest on social media than my official book launch, which was also really fun and great, the next day, because it just kind of, fired people's imaginations and they thought it was fun. So I think, the author, you have the license to be crazier and weirder and more out there than the publisher is really allowed to be. And I think you can come up with those ideas yourself.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll move on to another question. I think what I'll pick next is, what is different and what has remained the same in marketing and publicity of books? And David, could I bounce this to you for a start, please?
Sure. Well, one thing that has stayed the same is for the 40 years is my 40th anniversary of being in publishing, and I am for the 40th year hearing about the death of the book. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't believe it's going to happen anytime soon. So that's the good news. I think that marketing and publicity has changed. Obviously, it's moved online, and discovery is increasingly important. And I agree, with what Jenny said about authors being engaged. My own feeling is it's always been important, and the best spokesperson for your ideas and your work is always going to be you. You know it better than we do. You know the subject better than we do. But it is true that increasingly publishers are coming to rely on that more and more. And I think that move into the digital universe has been profound. I actually think it's changed a lot over the COVID period. When authors come to me, if they don't already have a blog, we tend to tell them, if you're going to start a blog, you better be in it for the long haul. It's just putting up a blog for your book and not doing anything with it isn't really going to do much for you. It's the engagement that you can get around a blog that makes that important. That, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I'm not quite sure what the time frame would be. Blogs were it, and everybody was finding that. But it's always the case that you've got to market your blog just like you have to market your book, or no one's going to go there. So, but increasingly that is a social activity, and the way to get attention for yourself increasingly is through social media. Personally, I'm not a Twitter person, but I do follow a few people and click on that, and that leads me to discussions that are important. So I think you have to learn to engage in that appropriately. There are historians. I think the group of historians amongst the academic are some of the most active people in social media. It feels that way. Who really seem to get excited by it and dive in head first into the discussion there. But I don't think you need to do that. I think what you want to do is find appropriate ways for you to engage in conversation in social media that can draw attention to you and your ideas. And then I'll stop, but I just want to end with advice to authors that marketing your book is something you often hear from academics as sort of a, ew, do I really have to do this? I'm not comfortable marketing my book and all. Is to keep in mind that this isn't selling used cars. You know, you're not trying to get Jenny to take the extended warranty on your book or something like that. You're really presenting and trying to promulgate your ideas, and that you spent a lot of time putting together, researching, working on, and writing, and that you think are important to the world. And there's actually no reason to be afraid of, scared about, or ashamed of doing that. It's an invaluable part of our civil structure, and encourage you to do it.
Thank you, Beth.
Oh, I just wanted to, I totally agree. I hear that a lot from academics and book authors, or just academics about their research in general. And I just want to sort of relate a tale of a friend of mine who wrote a book on the suffragette movement. It's not environmental, but she went gangbusters, and the book, I don't think it sold well, but it did much better than anticipated from her perspective, because what she did was, you know, she wrote something for Cognoscenti, which is a WBUR for those in Boston, like a sort of an essay, like a place where you can go. From that, she got an interview on, I think, Radio Boston at BUR. She would call up podcasts regarding women's rights and say, hey, do you want someone to be on? Because it's actually, a lot of podcasts really need guests, and they struggle with it because they're operating on a real shoestring. So like, if you have the wherewithal to spend an hour finding interesting podcasts, and I don't think, like, to Deborah's point, you can't really trace sales, I think I recall her telling me, to like a podcast, but it is publicity and things do happen from it. It just seems time is sort of what you need, and some creativity, to Jenny's point.
Thank you. Brenda, would you like to comment?
Oh, yes, I have lots of comments. I have a comment for everything that's just been shared because it's all so true. I mean, one of the things that I have certainly seen change is the long arc of review or book coverage attention. You know, for a university press like us, you know, it was never, you know, it was never that concentrated, you know, the Obamas had their book out and is, you know, everything happens in 10 days. You know, it was always a much longer arc for a university press. But these days, it is way long, like over a year, well into the paperback life. It has just turned into a 2-year thing for me to be or a 3-year thing. And I just go ahead and do the paperback as well if we do paperback the book, because it's just such a long arc of coverage. And that's, I don't know, I think that's in a way encouraging. You know, it kind of keeps it out there for awards. You know, I think it helps the book give it a better chance to actually become a solid backlist book. Lots of excerpts, definitely. That's a big change. You know, just the email agreement back and forth between the conversation or whomever. You know, I know Norton is, you know, their publicity department, that is a big aspect of what they do now. You know, not so many reviews do we see anymore, but we see lots of little excerpts on LitHub or wherever, you know, just all over the place, giving people a little taste of the book and a live link to the book's page on the publisher's website. About the podcast and Twitter, 2 things. You know, I want to agree with you know, telling an author, even when the author turns in a manuscript, to, if you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter. Even that is a little bit too late. But you know, Twitter has become just journalists talking to journalists. And I see a lot of historians, environmental writers in that space, getting in there and just watching. And it can become a huge ally, huge, in the way that person ends up in what are still called Rolodexes, even though they're digital. We see a lot of our authors get discovered that way, and very powerful tool. And I really see that in the next, you know, 4 to 10 years, given everything that's happening in our economy and the push behind the Green New Deal is being a really important. Lastly, podcasts. I love the podcast space for books. These are serious people. It's maybe niche, but they really want the info that is being discussed. And I think authors have a better chance of getting on those podcasts by reaching out. There's something about the authenticity that's desired in that world. In social media generally, they don't want to hear from me, however articulate, I am about, or however catchy my pitch is or clever my subject line. They would much rather hear from the author. And so I think that's a great place and where we're sending a lot of our authors to.
Okay, great. Thank you. Deborah, Jenny, would you like to comment as well?
I have a question. Am I on? Yeah. I have a question. It's a question and a comment, which is what is going on with conferences? Because I think that what I'm seeing is I know that's where I find out about books. And I think people are pretty religious in conferences about going to the book display. So it's such a great place to find out about books in addition to get discounts. And what I see is I'm not sure trade publishers especially are sending books to the virtual displays right now. And I wondered if any of the publishers could talk about that, because that seems to me such an important marketing channel, I would think, especially for books that are good candidates for, being taught. And I wonder, how that's working. For the publishers on the call, like what are you sending books to conferences? Like, how has that process changed?
I'll field this for a little bit and then I'll bounce it, I think, to David for a comment. I'm a big believer in professional and scholarly conferences, and I would have been normally, over the course of the time we've been in the pandemic, traveling to a lot of different kinds of meetings, from big ones to small ones. And I have missed that aspect to my job and my life greatly, because I find going out and just meeting people and talking with folks at a book exhibit, I information gather in a lot of direct and indirect ways, and I miss it terribly. We at Yale University Press have set up virtual book exhibit pages, and we have advertised them in the meeting programs and provided little links with coupon codes so you can go order our books off the exhibits book list and get a 30% discount, but it doesn't frankly work all that easily. Things get lost. There's just nothing like being, in a real place at a real time. The other thing I miss is I would talk with my peers from other presses at these meetings. And again, you information gather in a way that you can't when you're not doing that. So we have tried many things, in terms of virtual exhibits and marketing outreach. And in some cases, it's reasonably successful. And others, well, you have the gratification of knowing you've done it and you've tried your best, but it's honestly, I think, not always ideal. David, what do you think? You're on mute.
I'm mute, not anymore. I absolutely agree with you, Jean, about missing it. It's affecting our acquisitions. It's affecting, our ability to form relationships with potential authors, our ability to get our books noticed for potential adopters or people who are going to buy it there or elsewhere later. It affects rights. The shutting down of London and Frankfurt book fairs, where a lot of publishers get translation rights for the books and all, has all of these things that last year went virtual or not at all. Some places didn't even do anything. And I think they're still struggling to figure it out. Simply hanging a page with a bunch of books on it it's nice, but we haven't seen any real uptake in sales from it either. I think what's missing, and I don't know how easy this is going to be to solve, is that sort of integrated sense of community that happens at a conference. Right now, it feels to me, and I haven't been to tons of them, but our editors have sort of reported back a little bit that it's, you go to a Zoom meeting and you go to that meeting and then you go here. There's not the flow between things that is, and it's in those cracks where a lot of the good stuff from conferences comes from. And I assume that many conferences will go back to being a mix of in-person and virtual, but it's still a little hard to know.
Yeah, we all miss it. Susan Susan Ferber, do you want to comment at all?
Sure. Thanks for including me. This has been a topic of great discussion among the university press directors. They're part of an association called the AUP, and they are all checking with each other to see, what do your budgets look like? What are you planning on doing? When can your staff travel again? And the big open question, I think, is, will any of the attendees of these meetings, with their university funding, in many cases, if it existed before, being slashed, who will show up? Who will travel? Who will come? Will we be able to just go back to being in those conference hotels and having the kind of environment we had before COVID, or is that not going to happen? I agree completely with David and Jean. We've spent a lot of time doing virtual exhibits in many, many different disciplines at Oxford University Press, and the sales they're pretty dreadful. But I also feel like people want to pick up books. They want to look at them. They want to spend time engaging. They want to come up to a booth and say, what do you have in X? I'm doing a course on this. And that's missing. So a lot of the conferences, the bigger ones, have set up like sort of a Zoom room, places for publishers to sit and take questions, which I've spent more hours in over the past year than I'd like to comment on. But, I could be there for 4 days, like 3 people will show up. And that's just not what happens in an actual booth. So I don't think people are really trained yet to spend time in the virtual exhibit halls, no matter how many reminders they get from the conferences. And as somebody who's really embarrassed this week to see that my publisher does not in fact have a virtual exhibit booth at ASEH, there was miscommunication. Nobody got the message, but you literally have to build it from scratch for every different platform and every organization. And that's way more time consuming than what many exhibits departments can do. And starting with Jenny's, coming back to Jenny's question, I've really not seen commercial publishers doing this. I've really seen academic presses, university presses, and some niche presses. But I don't think that Random House and Simon & Schuster are spending time on virtual exhibit booths at academic conferences.
I suspect they're enjoying the cost savings.
Oh, yes. Well, there's also another interesting factor here, and it's one that I just have to kind of school myself with. And that is that many of us that are at institutions that have had complete bans on travel. I mean, Yale University has had very strict rules during COVID over where people can travel. Basically, they can't. And I mean, this has also affected scientists who do field research and anthropologists, because all that work, all that research depends on being able to travel to different parts of the globe and do your research. And actually, I was browsing the departmental website for the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University just a few days ago. I was cruising to look for some information, and they had a notice up that said they are accepting no new graduate students for this coming year because of the difficulties in helping them identify where they're going to do field work. We're going to see the effects of this down the road. There are going to be gaps, I think, in certain disciplines where people have achieved their training and gotten their degrees because of the prohibition against traveling. And I have no idea when we will be free at Yale University Press under the Yale University umbrella to be able to travel to a meeting again, because we're going to be governed by what Yale has decided is appropriate and a good best practice with COVID. Would anybody else like to comment? Jenny?
If someone else, because I was just going to mention one strategy that Norton did that I thought was really great, where they actually, so my book just came out, but it was ready in like late January. And so, and they actually rushed the production in order to allow people to teach it before it actually came out. And I think that's really unusual, but it was really effective because, especially now you're talking about, well, you don't get sales from book displays. If you're trying to market it as a teaching book, what happened was that when the book actually came out, there were all these people who had already taught it and all these students who had already read it. And so they were posting it on social media, because they'd already read it and they already knew what was in it. And so it just kind of, I think, helped with the academic marketing. I don't know how practical a strategy that is for most university presses or even trade, or trade presses. I think it's really unusual, but in this case, I thought it was really a great strategy, and it was really helpful to as a way of getting kind of some advanced buzz for using it. Yeah.
Deborah, do you have some thoughts?
Well, I don't really have any thoughts about the conferences because, when the Narrow Edge first came out, I actually was able to attend a lot of conferences. I think it helped at all of those conferences that I was giving the keynote address. And that would be the same whether it was a Zoom conference or an in-person conference. I just wanted to go back to the conversation about Twitter. I am not a big Twitter participant, and yet I think that platform has worked extremely well for me, and that I just wanted to say you don't necessarily have to be tweeting all the time and retweeting all the time and collecting all this stuff to be tweeting and retweeting. It actually, when you add up the amount of time that this has to take on all these platforms, it's a phenomenal amount of time, and one that I haven't really found particularly useful for me. What's been much better and gotten much wider audiences is that the environmental community does that for me. The Defenders of Wildlife, Audubon, the right whale people, the Center for Conservation Biology, anytime that I write something, they deal with disseminating it. And I think it gets much, much more, it gets out to a much wider group of people and a much larger group of people that way. And I'm it's not that not being on Twitter isn't going to kill me eventually, but I feel that right now these other organizations are doing a much better job of it than I can.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, let's see. Back to the list of questions again, and we've already touched on this somewhat, but I'll throw it out, and if anybody would like to comment on some angle that we've not touched on, you're welcome to do that among the panelists. What is different and what has remained the same in marketing and publicity? Who would like to kick that off?
Well, Jean, I can't talk about that, but I wanted to say something from the last thread a little bit, and
Sure.
and maybe it's more of a broad statement. But when I was environment reporter at the Globe, like so the advice I give is like be bold and again, to Jenny's point, be creative. Like, and it was an Island Press book. I remember, and I can't remember the author, what the book was, but the more you develop relationships with some people in the press, like that's really useful. And you don't develop relationships by saying, can you cover my book all the time? Like that's a book review. But if you're covering a subject area that's really interesting, that's not being covered, and you call someone up and give them an idea, you develop a relationship, and they're more likely to quote you and probably would feel obligated to. And that sort of, that it enhances your brand in some way. I'm not saying the Globe's the only place, but other news outlets that have that kind of weight, and it really works. It worked for me when I was a reporter, and I'm little tip, but it's you don't want to approach a news outlet with looking for promotion, but if you come out with like an idea that someone can actually use, a little more indirect.
Beth, I wanted to just totally support that. Because in dealing with aspects of my book, there's been the publicity department at the publisher. All you guys know, all the book review editors, everybody who can help with book reviews. My contact list is actually completely separate from that. It's all of the environment writers. And I have the relationships with them that I've built up over the years. So they call me when they want background information on certain stuff, when they're researching something. And then when they are writing about something that is related to what I'm doing, they call me and they quote me. So I just wanted to support what you're saying. I think it's a really effective way to have relationships with people.
And I'd like to just kind of piggyback on that, because actually the publicist who worked with Deborah Kramer on her wonderful book and was so successful with us is a former Enviro reporter herself, married to an Enviro reporter who is still in that field. And, former journalists make wonderful publicists, because we are not sending out emails saying cover our book. We're saying, here's what's new, here's what's in this, or here's why you need to talk to Frank Snowden, one of Jean's authors, who was the go-to person at the beginning of the pandemic because of his work in the history of epidemics through the millennia. It's a completely different, it has to do with the disappearance of the book review aspect of it. It's book coverage. The editor of Pamela Paul has said, starting 10 years ago, it's just book coverage. It's just part of the conversation around books that has been going on ever since books have come into being. To me, that's a fruitful way of looking at it. There's a cultural conversation going on globally, and a book has its own voice, and the author is the best translator of that voice. And our job is to help connect the two, matchmakers.
The only, can I say one more thing? Because I feel strongly about this point. Like the more you can make a relationship to a current event, like I just read this book called The Traitor to His Species by a University of Tennessee author. And it's all about Henry Bergh and the birth of the animal rights movement. It's good. But it wasn't until he sort of wrote about like a horse flu pandemic back in 1918, that it had resonance with us at the conversation, and then subsequent news outlets, because it links something in the past to something present, and that's a story idea. So I'm sure all the books that people do, and Deborah, I know you do this a lot, and I remember your book. Your wonderful book was so celebrated because I ran the ASEH Awards at the time, and I think you won the Rachel Carson Award, which it just occurred to me. But you were very successful because you were quoted in so many other places. So yeah.
David, would you like to comment further?
Well, I was going to cycle back to, and this gets to the change I think in publicity and all, is to webinars, and our experience might be a little bit different because we are so connected to environmental organizations and their media. But prior to COVID, we would do webinars, and they were successful, 100 people, 110 people, things like that. Last year, on average, our average webinar had over 2,000 registrants, and the average attendance was 1,200 people. We didn't sell a lot of books. I mean, we would sell maybe 20, 25. I think one we sold 100, but you don't know how many you're selling in Amazon 2 days later or 3 days later or whatever. And it does get to the notion that it's as much publicity as selling. I think what's important is that while a lot of the trade publishers are poo-pooing webinars because it doesn't sell, if you go to the Politics and Prose in Washington and do an event, you could easily sell 200 books. They could pre-sell 200 books before the event, probably. A lot of our authors are never going to get to Politics and Prose and have that opportunity. So the chance to get themselves out there to a targeted audience is really valuable. And you'll see a lot of people sort of poo-pooing the webinar, but I think they're not necessarily seeing it as broadly as they might. There's an old marketing thing that, someone has to have 3 touches before they buy a book. And a few years ago, I was told it was 5 touches. And someone recently said, no, it's 7 touches. Well, I don't know how many touches it is, but every one you can get is important. And so I think one of the things to do is to think of publicity as publicity, of getting the word out, getting yourself connected in positive ways. If you do that well, the sales will follow. Like I say, you're not selling used cars here, you're getting your ideas out in the world, and that's how sales follow.
Benny.
I just want to speak a little bit to how different it is to present your work on Zoom. And this feels very meta, talking about this on Zoom. But I have found, like, when I start, first of all, I hadn't done any public speaking in a year, so that was hard, but also because of COVID. But also for me, trying to figure out how to present, it started to occur to me that presenting my work in person to people and presenting my work on Zoom were 2 really, really different things. And then I had to completely rethink how I did it. And so I think, that's worth thinking about, is like how to be effective speaker on Zoom. And I think, for me, it was usually I use a ton of images, and I just felt like, when you're in person, you rely on that connection with people. You can tell if they're excited or engaged, and you can kind of shift gears if you feel like they're not, because you're in person, and you get that energy from them as well. And when you're on Zoom, it can really feel like you're just talking into a black hole, which makes it very hard to, because one of the key things is to remember that you have an audience and to really speak to that audience. So for me, I've actually stopped using images when I present the work, because I feel like it just feels like I can't see people, and just started talking instead, which sounds really counterintuitive, but I think it's worked better. I think I'm definitely try to keep it super short. My talks are like half as long as when I'm presenting them in person. It's like no more than 20 minutes. I usually try to keep it to 10 or 15. And, just be like more animated, more provocative, more short sentences, keep repeating stuff. And one thing I'd like to do, which I haven't, is, there are fun things that you could do with the chat, because I think asking people questions and getting them to talk to you and tell you what they think is also really, really important for keeping a Zoom presentation animated, especially when you only have one speaker. I think that can be important. And I kind of feel like in some ways, Zoom is it's kind of, under strategized. As a way, we sort of all just think, oh, well, it's quite kind of like putting courses online, right? Like you actually have to think about them incredibly differently when you put them online. You can't just take the course you teach and put it online. And I think maybe we've kind of under-strategized so far about how to transfer our presenting online as well. So, and any ideas that other folks have, I'd be very grateful for in terms of how to be more effective.
That's great. We're always on a learning curve here, and the learning curve doesn't flatten out. Would anybody else like to comment?
I have a question, and I see a lot of people are posting in the chat questions too. I just wanted to see. I don't know if it enters us, but I'm just curious. Do people do a lot of book groups? Like, do you go to book groups to do these Zoom calls?
Well, I know we have a book group within the press that moved itself to Zoom, but that's just, employees within Yale University Press. And I have to confess, right now in my life, I don't have time to do like book clubs for the fun of it. Does anybody else know more about this than I do? I have to imagine that book clubs have moved on to Zoom.
Oh yeah, we had an author come to my book club in Brookline, and it was really effective. We all bought it seemed like we all bought the book. I just didn't know if that was a marketing ploy.
Beth, I have gone to people's book clubs. It's easier, obviously. All this stuff I find a lot easier to do because of Zoom, because I have things I want to write. I have policy groups I'm working on. I don't really have the time to do all this travel. So for me, the Zoom is actually a much more efficient way of doing things. And I do go to book clubs, but again, I think for me, like I'm doing, I think a ton of Zoom meetings this month, but they're all related to, there was some news item that was related to shorebirds and horseshoe crabs in the New York metropolitan area. So I'm like talking to every Audubon on Long Island and in New York. So it's very concentrated and focused on the issues that were raised in the book as they pertain to the people who are living in that area. So that's one thing, Jenny, that has really altered the way I give talks. When I do it on Zoom meetings now, I actually end up spending more time preparing for them than I would have otherwise, because the content is different every time because it's geared to the particular audience. And by doing that, that guarantees all the participation afterwards, so that I don't really have to worry whether or not I'm connecting to the audience or not. It's built into the way the presentation is done.
And I would just tag on to that and say classes. I mean, I've been Zooming into classes like crazy, and that is a real advantage that, you know, normally you can only do so many trips. And of course you get paid a lot more when you actually go there. But you know, whenever I find out someone wants to teach my book or is teaching my book, I say, hey, I'd be happy to pop into your class. And I think you can get students a lot more excited. They feel very special, you know, that the author has popped into their class. And I think it helps. I think that's a really important audience, is those young people.
I agree with Jenny, and I just wanted to add, in terms of book groups, I absolutely think that, as Jean said, people have pivoted to existing ones online. I had an idea, and I only have one book club meeting to give an example from, but I had an idea for starting an OUP History Book Club, a virtual one, which started last month. And we're doing one book a month with the author in conversation with a backlist author from across different disciplines, not just environmental history, and to choose really carefully, like a mix of different areas. And there were about 95 to 100 people who attended live. Wow. It was a Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, but I've noticed we're up to over 2,000 views of the video afterwards. So, you know, people who are not free on a Thursday at midday, you know, are watching it later. But we also live had attendance from 5 continents. And that to me was like one of the most thrilling things I've seen, when people were popping up and saying, I'm here from Senegal or from Haiti or from, you know, parts of the subcontinent in India and the UK. It was evening time. We had people from Europe, and that was truly exciting. Now, how many have purchased books? I don't actually have good data on that yet. And I have no idea month to month if people will keep coming back, as if it's a book group that no matter what the topic is, they'll continue to attend, or whether it will be the military historians who come for the military books and the people who are interested in Mahjong just coming for that one meeting. But I'm excited to see what that venue might be able to do.
So Susan, how did you get the word out about the first book club meeting?
It was a mix. I mean, marketing definitely helped with this. They did some advertising on Goodreads, on Kirkus. We did a lot of social media, so the Twitter feed, the Facebook pages, and then it was getting picked up in other places. There was no print advertising for this, and I think each month there'll be more, and we're definitely targeting, for instance, for next month, some museums, historical societies. It's a military history book, so, you know, American Revolution roundtables, the people who would be the most likely audience. But in terms of the general audience, I think some of, like, what we really wanted was to get general readers, and to think both in terms of the profession, like the OAH or the AHA or smaller societies, but also people who are not scholars. So I don't know how everybody who attended or has watched since has gotten involved, but it was, it's definitely a learning curve activity.
That's a great idea. So listen, should we segue to some of the questions that have been coming in over the chat?
Definitely.
You want to pick the first one?
Sure. This first one comes from somebody who is going back to the book review question. Can you elaborate on the decision to review or not review a book by major publications? And by that, I'm assuming this person means the New York Times Book Review or the Washington Post or places like that. How far in advance should books be submitted? And is there an extra hurdle from books from university presses?
Brenda, would you like to take that one?
Oh, it's an age-old question, isn't it? It's, I feel like, that's been the tea leaves, reading the tea leaves at the book review and the Washington Post and all of that. I mean, certainly as those publications have dwindled in terms of number of pages, publishers don't advertise in print. I mean, this was just said, no print advertising. I mean, that really has affected the number of books that these publications can even cover. The few, you can count on one hand, the ones that even have a book review editor and are assigning the traditional reviews. And as I was saying earlier, the current editor of the Times Book Review has been trying to tell publishers for over a decade now, it's coverage. Don't be, coming at us, just, demanding what they had been used to previously for their top authors. I mean, there's no question for smaller, they're going to review the big books by the big brand name authors. But they are, it's interesting. They are looking for quality. And there is an important place for university press books in that conversation. They're very well aware that a trade house, books that a trade house would have published 10 years ago are now being published by university presses, as the trade houses, are not focusing anymore as much on those early authors or standing by a mid-list author, as the publishers have consolidated and the numbers get bigger and bigger. So it's interesting. I've really seen a trend over this past year of fewer reviews. It's time consuming. The lead time, you have to get your galley, be it electronic or print, 3 or 4 months in advance to those editors. And even then, we're seeing in those outlets, reviews appearing a year after publication. And that's even when you've given plenty of lead time on the front end. That's where excerpts come in. That's where author interviews come in. People are so busy. I think I maybe could point to that over the course of my career as one of the things that has most impacted book coverage in both locally, regionally, and nationally. People don't have the time to write those books. The editors want to know from me, how long is the book and how is it written? And if it's short and if it's written well, it'll stand a great chance by an authoritative figure. Those are the 3 things. An authority, they'll review the 900-page book, but it really better earn every page.
Yes. David, would you like to comment?
Just to agree with Brenda, I think increasingly you hear from publishers or people in publishing how book reviews don't sell books the way they used to, even if you get them. And I would say that oftentimes off the book page is more valuable than the book review. It's a really hard thing for authors because it's been ingrained in all of us that, getting a New York Times book review is really what you need or the best thing possible. And it's certainly nothing you want to avoid. There's just the richness of media out there now is hard to even fathom sometimes. And there's lots of places you can go that it can be as effective or more effective than some of these traditional places. It's figuring it out and figuring out who your audience is, particularly if you're for authors and all, and being true to that audience. I think that you can't. I have a saying that I use with authors is don't lose the audience you have to reach in a somewhat vain attempt to reach an audience you probably can't. There's nothing wrong with specializing. There's nothing wrong with, being in a particular part of the Wall Street Journal, a section and all of that, if that's the section where your readership is likely to be, or to be doing activities that feel targeted. Everybody goes for mass. Everybody wants the big hit. And in fact, that's really kind of the end product of a lot of spade work.
Okay, great, thank you. Shall we move to another question? Susan, what's another one?
Sure. this one has come up and I think probably will be of interest to many people who are on this call. Do first-time authors struggle more than well-established authors to sell their books during the pandemic? And I have some thoughts on that, but I want to turn it to everybody else first.
I'll go, yes. I think it's harder for first-time authors in the pandemic or not. You don't have, what publishers call platform, which is, a mix of authority and recognition in the media world. And as remember, that's your audience for Getting Media isn't your readers, it's the people in media. And it can be hard for first-time authors. There's no question about it.
Well, I think it's also been hard even for established authors. I've had some authors in my lists the last 3 seasons who've often, we've had really wonderful results with them. But some of them their books were so exquisitely badly timed last February, March, April. And some of those authors also worked really hard to get out there and master giving talks on Zoom. And in spite of that, the results were honestly maybe not ideal. And I guess the way I've looked at it is we've all had to take a bunch of hits on the chin. It's a matter of picking yourself up and figuring out what you can do going forward, and continuing to get out there to speak to groups that really are focused on your book and your interest, and being persistent about it and having patience over time should help. There's no guarantee it will help everybody for everything. I guess I would think of it as try to be doggedly persistent.
And I would just add on to that just really quickly, that you're now an author with a book. You've written a book. You're now an author with a book. And that is a great place to go from. And so I think it's a wonderful time to be writing books right now, because there is so much room to put yourself out there. People think and want to hear stories told in the first person. The National Book Critics Circle, when they award prizes every year, that category of criticism has really become just another category of autobiography. People really want to hear from writers. They want to hear how you got interested in this subject. They really want to hear from young voices, and how you came interested in that subject and how you came to write about it. That is, and anyone here who presents, right? That's the question people always want to know. How did you come to write about? How did you get into the subject? How did you get it published? It's like still the biggest thing in the universe that can happen, getting a book published, and it is. So I would just take heart and just see it as a brick in an amazing edifice that you're building, and you still don't know what it will look like in the end, but it will be beautiful.
I just wanted to support what Brenda was saying in that department. The very first book that I wrote came out on September 11th, 2001. And my entire publicity tour was canceled. Every NPR interview I had was canceled. I did actually manage, my publisher managed to get me a full page review in the New York Times, and the reviewer hated the book, and his venom against me and my book was there, very strategically placed just opposite the bestseller list. So you can't really ask for anything much worse than that. What I wanted to say about it is that whatever happens in a 3-month period or a 6-month period doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what happens over the long haul. That book is still in print, it's still selling, and just last week I was asked to give a huge lecture at Brown University about that book, and I have to go back and read it because I wrote it a long time ago, but I think that you know, these initial tragedies don't necessarily determine what happens over the longer haul.
Right, but Deborah, please tell us what is the title of that book. I've read it. Actually, I read it before I ever met and crossed paths with Deborah to work on The Narrow Edge, and I loved it. So tell us the title.
Oh, that book is called Great Waters, an Atlantic Passage, and it's a natural history of the Atlantic Ocean. It had the, you know, the I guess, unfortunate in some people's perspectives, situation where there weren't any people in the book. And I happen to refer to the ocean as she, and that was what outraged the New York Times book review editor. But I had a lot of fun reading that book, and that book has a lot of fans, Jean, like you, people who read that book and came to me. And I mean, you came to me and said that whenever I was ready to write something else, you would be delighted to hear about it. And that was a long time after the disaster of September 11th. So I really do think that, and I received a comment, who sent me, I think it was Bill McKibben. I got 2 postcards from people when that book was published. One came from an editor in a magazine I know, and he just wrote and he said, "Don't worry, any review in the New York Times is a good review." And that was I mean, I think maybe that's true. The book sales skyrocketed after that. And then the other postcard, I think, came from Bill McKibben, and he just said, "Look, don't worry about this. Water seeks its own level." And I think that that's actually true. So.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment, or maybe we'll move on to another question?
I just wanted to say, from a first-time author versus established author perspective, what David said about platform and what others have said is absolutely true. But in some cases, it's the junior scholars I'm working with who have really spent more time establishing their platforms. They've been out doing fellowships, they've been at conferences, they've been working with their graduate school cohort, they've been meeting people like actively as part of their career, sometimes as part of job interviews that failed and they didn't get the job. So in many cases, they are among my more networked authors in the sense that they've been not resting on their laurels, but actually like plugging their ideas for a while. And that's not plugging the book, but plugging the ideas and talking about what they do, why it's important, and figuring out how to pitch that to a number of different audiences for different kinds of jobs, for different, different things they've been applying for. And so in some ways, they have been better equipped than some of my more senior authors who may not have done any of this for a while. And I agree, it's great when you have an author that you could, say, we've got so-and-so that they're author of these prize-winning books, and media could respond to that. But in many cases, it's junior authors who have friends who are saying, my friend's book just came out. Here's a photo with me and their book. You should get it. It's great. And that kind of word of mouth is just as important. And I think, many, many times that people forget about the emails that they send and the fact that you can have author of new book on your signature line and be directing people to your book when you're doing your daily activities. And I think some people feel like that's kind of not comfortable, but in many ways, it's the people who are doing those kinds of daily activities without thinking about it a lot who are doing a great job over the long haul. As has been said, academic books and, ones that are not necessarily about current events have a very long tail. And it's not unusual for people to pick up, read, and value books for years and years. And this is not true of the sort of books for the moment.
Well said.
Absolutely. Susan, should we try another question?
Yes. How important are book tours in selling books? What about professional audiences? I'm guessing that we should probably also say how important are Zoom book tours here versus in person.
Okay.
Because I think a number of you have done both and have spoken about this a little, but this is a very specific question about touring.
Well, I'll take a piece of this and then I'm be happy to bounce it to someone else. So there are book tours and there are book tours. So pre-pandemic, it's only very large trade houses, I think, for the most part, and only a select handful of authors for whom the funds are available to travel around and do a big splashy, in-person book tour. From time to time, I've had authors who have been funded by some entity or another. And we don't, at Yale, we really don't have the resources to pay for book tours. But occasionally I've had authors who've had funding and the means to get out and talk up their books. It's very tough to do these tours unless you, I think, are pretty well established and would really draw a crowd, say, into a bookstore like a Barnes and Noble. But finding a special, a targeted audience that would be really interested in your book and setting up a lecture. For example, I've published a number of books with botanical topics, and the authors have a network with, say, the botanical gardens and the community that offer lectures. And then there is a tie-in. Often the garden also has a bookstore, so there will be a tie-in with a signing. So something like that that's very targeted and focused into the right community can be productive and effective. Would anybody else like to take over and comment on some other aspect?
Well, I'll just say that even the large publishers are cutting back and limiting book tours. And that started happening a while ago. When I first got into the business, a 20-city book tour was not unheard of, and that's a pretty rare beast these days, except if you're, a really high-profile, successful author. And even then, a lot of authors don't want to go to 20 cities. So some do, but the virtual aspect of that. What I'm finding, and I don't have any data to back this up and all, but the more successful independent bookstores are taking the traditional book tour or book event, let's say, and turning it into a financial plus for them. They're charging upfront for tickets that include the purchase of the book, plus a little more. They're wrapping it into, an educational kind of event, or they've gotten, again, I mentioned politics and prose because they've gotten very, I think, creative about what an author event is and looks like, as well as continuing to do the standard 150 people in the bookstore or whatever they hold in their main bookstore there. So I don't know how widespread that can be, and certainly the smaller independents have a hard time doing that. But it's a trend that seems to be working for the more established independents.
Okay, thank you. Beth Daly, by the way, had to jump off. Jenny, you want to say something?
Yeah, so I actually asked Norton about a virtual book tour after we landed the local bookstore, and they said, well, the problem with that is you're competing with yourself. So I think, again, to kind of piggyback on what, David, you were the last one, right?
Yeah.
Just said that, for bigger names, they can probably draw audiences who would normally go to that, local event in person. But I think if you're not a really established name, then you're mostly drawing on, probably the majority of the folks you're drawing on are the same people who would go to each one. So I'm not sure if that's true, but I have had other authors say, yeah, I did 8 events and I don't think they're really selling books, but publicity is publicity. But it is something to consider, at least, that you are on the one hand, with virtual events, you can reach an international audience, which is fantastic. On the other hand, you're also reaching the same audience with every tour potentially, with every event. So I'm not sure.
I think an important thing to keep in mind in all this is 15 months ago, most of us didn't know what Zoom was. we're still, as has been said, I think a couple of times, we're still learning how to use this thing. And the notion of mass video, pretty much almost free to people at large, is a pretty new concept.
Yeah, that to me is an exciting prospect. Kara Swisher had this great op-ed, I think it was in yesterday's New York Times, about the top areas where this last period is going to leave a more lasting impact. One of them is how people work, whether they're in an office every day or not. One is in education. The Zoom learning, and who's really willing to pay $65,000, $75,000 a year anymore for an education that at least partly could be held online. And that's where I see an opportunity for books. I mean, what you're seeing here is a certain people wanting to learn, people wanting serious ideas that have pretty much evaporated from mainstream media in America. Right, and so there is a hunger out there again for quality, for serious scholarship, for vetted. At a university press, this book has been vetted by your peers in your field. It comes with a stamp of approval, not just the Yale name, but your field, in essence. So there's a sense, I hope, in which a book gets tied to instructional material, lifelong learners. We baby boomers, we're going to, one day hopefully have time to go back and get that extra, graduate degree, whether in reality or virtually by what I read and what I study. We're wanting a book attached to that experience of learning. We're wanting that professors, that lecturers, that experts book, hopefully in paperback. But that's where I see a lot of opportunity and where I plan to spend a lot of my research time for our books.
Great, thank you. Susan, should we try another question? And I'm just noting that we will be closing in on the end of this session in about 10 minutes. If you all who have been attending want to leave us an email address, we have some handout that we're working on that we can share with you afterwards. So we'll be happy to do that. Susan, what's another question?
Sure. This is a whole nother panel, but I'm going to raise this question because one of the participants has brought it up, and this is about open access monograph publishing. And this participant says, I've agreed to be a guinea pig for my press, Georgia, by having my new book, Deep Cut, Science, Power, and the Unbuilt Interoceanic Canal, published by the Sustainable History Monograph Pilot, as well as available in print. While European scholars seem to be doing this kind of thing much more often, it still seems stigmatized in the US. And before I throw that out to everybody, I just want to say I am also a publisher who's involved in what they have called, weirdly, SHUMF, where the Mellon Foundation has funded a certain number of books from a group of university presses. I think there are 30 or 40 involved. And the first maybe 7 or 8 of these books are out. Tome is another open access funding, but I think one of the reasons this is such a big issue in Europe and in the UK is that there are different government guidelines about if you've gotten funding from one of these governments, then you have to make your work available open access. That has not yet been a requirement in the US, but we're definitely learning more about open access and the reach and the accessibility of these books, who's actually spending time with these monographs, and they are really monographs. These are not books that are, for the most part, crossover or trade books. And I could certainly say from the calls that I've been on, seeing the results just for the first few, that the ones that are about parts of the world, for instance, Asia, has been, very obviously geographic uptick in the open access readership, or at least people accessing them. I can't say that they read them, but I'm wondering if other people have open access experiences they'd like to talk about.
David?
We've done a few things open access, and I wouldn't say very successfully in terms of getting the book noticed and distributed very widely. Whether that's our fault or I'd like to think of it more as just an environmental not environmental in the sense of the environment, but of the publishing environment, of not really knowing quite what to do with open access yet. I mean, forget the financial model, which is an issue for publishers, there's no question. And that needs to be developed more. There aren't a lot of Mellon foundations out there who can finance all of publishing. But it's hard to get publicity for it. It's hard to get reviews for it. Again, we haven't done a lot of it, so I don't have a particularly robust set of data points here or anything. We had one of the library platforms tell us they wouldn't take it for free because they would only take for sale items. So some of the cultural and industry sort of infrastructure issues that haven't often been sort of raised in the open access conversation because people are not unreasonably focused on the business model and things like that. But I think there's a longer way to go.
Yeah, so at Yale, we do have a number of our titles that actually the ones in technology in particular, those authors often came in and actually negotiated as part of their contracts and understanding that there would be the option of a Creative Commons license for their book. And for the most part, it was incumbent on those authors to provide the platform and the location for that edition. I have very limited experience with this so far. Actually, this week, an author who is based in Switzerland through the Swiss National Science Foundation got funding so that there would be a Creative Commons edition of her book available through the book's webpage at yalebooks.com, and it just got posted today. So I'm on a learning curve with this. This book happens to be a fairly focused monograph, so it falls in that category Susan's just described. And I'm pleased that the author and we have worked this out, and I hope it's going to facilitate conversation about the topic of her book.
In addition to participating with some of the other scholarly and university presses for open access, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of concerted, efforts to bring open access or open titles up for free as part of our educational mission. And one of our Mellon funded initiatives, the Art and Architecture e-portal, as I mentioned earlier, we have a very large art history list, and we distribute and co-publish catalogs with major museums, and that is the permissions for the images for those books has historically just been a real burden for scholars, and that Art and Architecture e-portal is an attempt to meet that need, as well as putting these books up available. It's a subscription model, and so it's libraries that will sign on, but it is easily accessible once someone can find them through libraries.
Okay, great, thank you. Susan, do we have time for one more question?
I think we do, and I'm not sure I understand this question. Perhaps you on the panel will better. Book marketing agency, what is the collective thoughts on these agencies?
Oh,
I don't know if this person means like sort of freelance hiring of publicists, or an agency like a third party that's not the publisher, but you could riff on any part of that you'd like.
well, Brenda, on the publicity end of it, sometimes after our catalogs go up, authors get approached by a freelance publicity firm offering, full service publicity on your book, dear author. We'll do a good job. And the thing is that if you haven't really talked with your editor and your publisher about what your in-house publicist is doing, you may well be spending money you don't need to spend. Now, there are times when it could be considered, but it needs to be in consultation with your publisher and hiring a publicist for specific kinds of work and publicity outreach that aren't part of what the house publicist normally does. So Brenda, would you like to take off from there and comment on that a little bit further? That's not necessarily book marketing, but that might be what that individual is referring to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to pick up the thread where you were going with that, you know, a way that a publisher could work with a freelance PR, freelance public or independent public relations firm would be, you know, what in essence what the author is buying is a publicist's time. So it's like, okay, freelance PR person or publicity firm, you focus on broadcast and have that include podcasting, and we'll focus on review and you know, everything else, including online only. If it can be considered a publication of whatever sort, we'll focus on that. Kind of divide and conquer so that you're not stepping on each other's toes. And you know, depending on the book, and if it's a newsworthy book, and there's a lot of regional NPR possibilities, that can be something that can work. It is expensive, but it can be very successful.
Jenny?
I'll just say quickly, because I worked with someone on a, just to help him get out a self-published book recently. And I can tell you as a result of that, there is a huge industry out there that is preying on people as well. I know there are, there's a really legitimate, really helpful, you know, set of publicists out there, but there's also a huge industry that is preying on people with all kinds of offers that are, you know, very expensive, and you will never, ever make that money back selling books. And, you know, just praying, because when you know, even, you know, folks who write books for a living, you know, get frustrated, right? Because we write the books and it's really hard to sell books, and we want people to read them. And so, you know, they have this industry has a lot to work with, and I'm sure that they're raking in a lot of money, but I think you have to be really, really careful about accepting, you know, unsolicited offers in particular.
Right.
Right. One tip is publishingtrends.com. They publish an annual list of freelance publicists. I consult that list when an author is asking, or when, you know, when the occasion arises, and their annual, what do they call it? Their freelance publicist contact sheet. I believe 2019 may be the most recent one, but you can find it on publishingtrends.com.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're about to the end of the session. Shall we wrap? So thank you everyone for attending. If you have left your email address in the chat and want the handout, we will be very happy to send that to you in the next several days. And all of us are available, reachable through our websites, and we're happy to hear from you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Beth. Thanks to Susan, David, everyone. Lawrence, is there anything we should do to wrap up before we exit?
No, I think we're all good. I was just going to tell you a couple things about the recording. It should, assuming it recorded properly, upload to my account in the Zoom cloud. From there, it'll be available for 6 months via a direct link I can send you.
Okay, great.
So you can access it that way right now. And then at that point, we can figure out what you'd like to do with it longer term in terms of saving it somewhere else, if you'd like to keep it longer than that.
Okay, sure. So how do we capture the email addresses for people who've asked about the handout?
I've cut and pasted them from the chat.
Great.
Okay.
And I just copied and saved the whole text to the chat too. It should also be saved as a separate file along with the recording, assuming it recorded properly.
Okay, great. Well, this has been a lot of fun. It's the first time I've ever done it and moderated it.
I learned a lot. I have a whole page of notes from you all, so thank you.
That's great. Deborah, how are you doing there?
I'm doing great. Thanks so very much, Jean. You did a great job.
Oh, thank you. Well, everybody was wonderful. I'm really thrilled. It was great. Somebody's giving a thumbs up there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted we had good turnout too. I mean, I think, you know, this was a whole new experiment for ASEH in terms of seeing how Environmental History Week would work, how much participation we would get for these events. And it's like I was saying before we started, I mean, they're, you know, each day, because the response has been so great, which is wonderful, but it means we've been having, you know, 15, 18 events a day on days when most people are at work. So if we can get a decent turnout at these things, that's great. So I'm delighted that happened today.
Yeah. Well, just imagine if we'd all been in Boston, what this would have been like.
I know. I would have loved to be walking around the book exhibit area right now. I mean, Susan, you told me it before, but it's still so depressing to think about you being in these virtual exhibit spaces for days on end and nobody shows up.
I mean, it's just weird, and at times, you know, especially the OAH last week, some publishers were like popping into each other's booths, and I'd like see somebody's name pop up and recognize them from, you know, NYU or wherever, and they'd be like, "Our booth is empty. Is there anybody in yours?" That I'd like try to chat with them, just because it was really strange spending like 8 or 9 hours monitoring a virtual space that nobody was coming to, or I shouldn't say nobody, but you know, 10 people a day maybe. But like nobody, there were no appointments. The whole thing is, it's not like attending a regular conference. And so when Jean and I were talking about, you know, the fact that we were going to do that, I think it was the Women's Environmental History Network, like evening event at last year's Ottawa conference, so that there was going to be a publishing table, and we were going to be like the experts, like sort of moderating discussion at the table. And when that conference got canceled, we were trying to think, well, what could we do like next year that would approximate that? And this was our attempt to do that. And I'm thank you so much, Lawrence, for making all the technology and the emails and everything else work, because that part of it is much less my expertise.
Yeah, you were
I'm just delighted it worked.
Thank you.
That was so helpful for me to hear you guys, because I was, you know, the idea of my book not being at the ASEH conference, you know, my home, like where I grew up as a thinker, was just, I was so upset. And I thought, and that was really interesting to hear, like, well, those book displays really don't seem to be selling books, which means probably a lot of people aren't, you know, necessarily looking at them. So but you know, maybe if there's another conference, I'm sure everybody's going to do things differently next year, because everybody's trying to figure out what works, you know.
Well, I hope before I kick it in and retire, I can go to at least one more ASEH. Next year it's in Eugene.
Oh, it's in Eugene next
Yeah.
year? Oh, I'm there. Wow. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, those guys are doing such great things out there.
I think going to meetings and meeting with people is the best part of my job. And I have found it really hard to be isolated at home like this. I think I at times have really could be defined as clinically depressed. I've just really missed it.
Yeah, I understand where Jean's coming from, because it feels so strange. We're used to a pattern, at least for me, like 12 months a year. I know every time of the year where I will be and what group I'll be with, and that like logging off of a Zoom Slavic studies thing feels weird. Like there's none of what happens around a conference and what makes it fun and what makes being an editor like the enjoyable part. But I was thinking that the Eugene planning committee must have been in cahoots with Southwest, which yesterday announced that they will now have a Eugene, Oregon airport leg. And I'm so excited about that, because I saw it and I was like, this is going to be so much easier.
Yeah, I saw that.
That's
great to know. I actually didn't know that. That's going to be super fun. I've been trying to get out to Eugene for a while, and then COVID just shut that down. So yeah.
Let's hope that by then we'll be permitted to travel again. I mean, I was thinking I'd be able to go to meetings this fall, and like History of Science right now says they're still going to hold a real meeting in New Orleans. It's late October, early November, and we've had to put everything on hold because Yale still is saying employees can't travel.
military history is meeting next month with a hybrid conference, and apparently they have like 130 people registered for the hotels. So I have no idea how that's going to work. I mean, as those of you who are teaching, like, have often said to me, like, the hybrid is the worst of both worlds. It's bad for the people in the classroom. It's bad for those who are on Zoom. So, like, I can't see how a hybrid conference is going to be significantly better than just a Zoom conference or an in-person. But I should withhold judgment until I see how these things work.
So are you actually going to go to the meeting, Susan, or are you going to?
No, we're only participating virtually. I don't know if they'll even have tables in a book exhibit hall. Like, I have no idea who would be agreeing to do that, but it's going to be interesting to see what scholars and, people who are buffs have money and desire to get to the conferences in the next few months.
Well, who've been vaccinated, you know.
I have to take off. Thank you all.
Yeah, so do I.
It was great. I'm getting a copy of your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I have to go too. See you guys. Thanks so
Thank
very
you,
much.
everybody.
Nice to meet you,
All
Susan.
sign off. Okay. Susan, I'll talk to you later, okay?
Yep, sounds good.
Thanks.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Thanks again, everybody. I'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
It's fascinating.
I'm delighted. Thank you.